So this gets into something I want to talk about with you a little bit. I know we emailed about this a little bit. I don't know which way to go first. Basically, the point about simplicity, because I know that's a big thing for you, because I know at one point you endorsed the view that we kind of don't have any arguments for either side that should compel people to change their minds. I mean, I'd
Yeah.
agree. I think we kind of don't have any arguments. So then we go the route of kind of this abductive approach of like which theories have the best virtues as opposed to minimizing vices. And so we kind of get, it seems like you're arguing, I know in your book, The Best Argument Against God, you talk about how if these arguments don't offer us any reason to prefer, we should just go with what's simpler, which would be naturalism. And so I know we emailed about this a little bit, but I wanted to have it on record as well and talk about it because it's a point I've kind of run up against recently with people like, well, with professional philosophers like Josh Rasmussen a little bit, but also with just people who discuss these things kind of more like my age and everything. And that, it seems to be, and then I know also Trent Doherty was doing a video series on this, kind of inspired by some of Swinburne's stuff. And so some people want to actually somehow try to deny the idea that like naturalism is simpler. And so there are a couple of reasons they may do this. For one thing, they'll just appeal to, I think the one I've heard is that while naturalism has maybe fewer ontological entities, it has more that are fundamental, whereas theism just gives us one fundamental entity, God, and we don't have to posit. Because I think I was talking to somebody about this, and they cited in your discussion with Phaser, you offered the idea that maybe our metaphysical ground floor is just like this brute fact that electrons have a negative charge. Like maybe that's just the ground of our metaphysics, and we go from there. And so then Phaser wanted to argue that like, well, you're just kind of then committed to the same thing I am, just a lot more of them. And so that's kind of the route some theists want to go. They want to say that like, with theism, we just have this kind of one foundational thing that kind of grounds all other stuff. So we may have this natural stuff plus God, but like that still is simpler than kind of, because they'll go the route then that naturalism can't explain. I think a lot of these points actually just evolve into the debate about explanatory power and not about simplicity. But it is an interesting question, and I definitely am very confident that naturalism is a simpler theory than theism, but people seem to want to argue against that. So I did want to pick your brain a little bit on,
Sure.
kind of answering some of those objections.
So the principle that we were working with is that you should go for the simpler theory. And there's a question about what makes for the simplicity of a theory. And it's not the simplicity of what you identify as the kind of the salient fundamental entity, right? When you're working out what the theoretical costs of a theory are, you have to think about, okay, how many different kinds of entities does it postulate? How many different primitive predicates do you need in stating the theory? How many axioms do you need in order to state the theory? And so that's roughly sort of ontological, ideological, and then principles. And you want to be simple across all of them, right? I mean, if two theories are otherwise explanatorily equal, but one of them's simpler in one or more of those dimensions and not on the others, then you'll prefer the simpler theory. Something like that is the principle. Theists have a primitive commitment to electrons, no less than naturalists, right? Take the claim that God exists and do the derivation that gets me to the existence of electrons without adding anything else. You can't do it. There is no such derivation, right? What you have to realize is that most of our predicates don't have explicit definitions. So our ideological commitments are massive, right? We have a primitive use of cat, electron, star, and so on. But we also, if you're a theist, you have a bunch of other predicates which the naturalist has no use for, that are primitive as well. So ideologically, it's kind of obvious that the theist is going to do worse than the naturalist. But when you come to kinds of things that you've got primitive commitments to, it goes the same way, right? I mean, there's a sense of fundamentality here, which is irrelevant to the assessment of the complexity of the theories, because the theist says God made the electrons, right? So I'm only committed to God. But their theory talks about electrons. And from a theoretical point of view, that's just a primitive commitment. So it's not true that as a theory, theism comes out simpler. It comes out way more complicated as For example, I can remember some exchange somewhere where Paul Moser just said, yeah, this is obvious, right? There's the world versus there's the world and God and a bunch of other things, right?
Yeah.
Miracles and so on, right? There's just lots of extra stuff. You might think that in some sense, there's a kind, it's not simplicity. There's a kind of satisfying story here because God makes everything else. And so that means that your starting point for your theorizing, ignoring all the rest of the theory, is very simple. But that's just irrelevant when it comes to the question of theory choice. So this is what I think. This is what I think is the main thing that I would want to say in response to Josh Rasmussen's recent book, right? Because he makes a big deal about the simplicity of what's fundamental, but he forgets about all the things that are fundamental every time he's got something chancy. That's just fundamental. Every time he uses a predicate, it's fundamental, right? He didn't give an explicit definition of cat, and he couldn't, for example, but he thinks that there are cats, and so on. Anyway, so that's my take.
Okay, yeah, that's super interesting. So it seems like also, it's important to pin down that like it's not just the amount of things that are important. It's kind of important the category of these things as well. And I would talk about this because it seems to me, this may be wrong, but I was thinking about this, and I think I mentioned this in one of our exchanges in just terms of like categories of things. It seems like, postulating one entity versus one entity is not always going to be the same in terms of simplicity. So like one angel as opposed to one like rock, I don't feel like that's the same ontological commitment, partially because of like one thing's going to have a lot more properties. So that's one thing I like to point out too when people bring that up is like, we're not just talking about the number of things. Like I could have, say I bite the bullet on your point and say I'm committed to more fundamental things than you are. I feel like I can still get through the simplicity point because the kinds of things I'm committed to are just, in virtue of what they are, a lot simpler than the one thing that you're postulating.
Right. So there is a debate about whether numbers of things matters at all. So a friend of mine, Daniel Nolan, has a paper where he argues that it does matter, but there have been lots of people, David Lewis is one example, who thought that all that matters is the kinds, right? And the numbers of the actual things is irrelevant. I'm a kind of an open mind about this, but maybe I agree with Daniel Nolan. Maybe I think that the numbers matter too. But you're right that if absurdly your theory was that there's just one thing and it's an angel, and my theory is there's just one thing and it's a rock, it's going to be very hard to assess those theories for their simplicity, right? And I just think you can't do it. But that's not how the assessments of simplicity are going to work, particularly in the framework that I've got, because I think that in lots of cases, there's kind of no algorithm for working out which is the best theory once you start trading off simplicity against breadth and depth of explanation. You might have two views and you just think you can't actually make an assessment of which one's better. But in a case where you've got one theory that's committed to some things and another theory that's committed to all of those things and some more, then so long as they turn out to be explanatorily equal, you know which one is the theory that you should be going for. And that's the only kind of case that I'm kind of interested in the best argument against God. I'm interested in seeing how far you can run with the idea that you can make an argument for naturalism on those grounds.
Okay.
Right?
That's
everywhere the explanation's at least as good, but it's definitely simpler, so it wins.
Right. And I really love that approach because it's so epistemically humble. It's like, look, our arguments don't work like they shouldn't. And like I've had friends talk about this too. Like, there's no argument I could ever give, like, being an atheist, there's no argument I could ever give to Alex Proust that he wouldn't be able to give me a good answer.
Yeah.
And in the same way, there's no question another undergraduate theist would give you that you wouldn't be able to answer. So it's like, it seems like, and you've made a similar point about like you go up to Flanagan or Swinburne, they're going to be able to, talk up and down.
Yeah.
So it just seems like people, are going to, never going to be an argument that is going to, like a silver bullet in philosophy where you're just going to have to change your mind. And so that's why I really like your approach there. That's admitting that it's like, look, I'm not saying our arguments are perfect. We have some silver bullet against theism, but like, we just we just win the Occam's razor battle. So I appreciate that approach, and I think it's one people should adopt, because it kind of gets us along with this epistemic humility of like, hey, we don't know.